Commander Alara Vance stood at the observation deck of the UNSC Prometheus and watched the stars drift past like scattered diamonds against black velvet. She had spent 15 years serving the Galactic Concorde and believed every word they had ever told humanity about friendship and cooperation and mutual respect. Concorde had welcomed Earth into its embrace 300 years ago, arriving with gifts of technology and promises of brotherhood. They had taught humans how to travel faster than light, how to cure ancient diseases, how to reach distant worlds and build colonies among the stars. Every child on Earth grew up learning about the Great Uplift, that beautiful moment when benevolent aliens had lifted humanity from its primitive state and given them the keys to the universe. Alara had dedicated her life to honoring that gift. She had risen through the ranks of the United Nations Space Command, serving as a bridge between human forces and Concorde peacekeepers. She spoke 4 alien languages fluently and had earned commendations from species whose names most humans could not pronounce. She was exactly what the Concorde wanted humanity to become: grateful, loyal, and completely blind to the truth. The message came without warning on a quiet night during a routine patrol near the border of Valkyrie space. Her neural implant suddenly burned with incoming data, flooding her mind with images and documents and terrible, terrible knowledge. She collapsed against the viewport as information poured into her consciousness. Like acid eating through metal. Sender was a Valkyrie archivist named Korath, and he was dying. His species had served the Concorde for 10,000 years, maintaining their sacred libraries and preserving the histories of 100 civilizations. But Korath had found something he was never meant to see, and now assassins were hunting him through the corridors of his own temple. With his final breaths, he chose to share what he had learned with the one species he believed might actually do something about it. Alara saw the truth unfold in her mind like a flower blooming in darkness. Humanity had never been uplifted at all. 3 centuries ago, when the Concorde first detected Earth's primitive radio signals, they had not come bearing gifts. They had come bearing weapons. The original human scientists had already discovered faster-than-light travel. A team working in secret had cracked the fundamental equations and built a working prototype. But before they could announce their breakthrough to the world, the Concorde arrived. They studied the human technology, recognized its potential, and made a decision that would shape the fate of an entire species. They stole everything. They erased the research, eliminated the scientists, and burned every trace of humanity's achievement. Then they returned wearing masks of friendship, offering their own inferior FTL technology as a gift and watching humanity weep with gratitude for scraps from their own table. But that was not the worst of it. Korath's archives revealed a pattern that repeated across the galaxy. Every species in the Concorde had suffered the same fate. The Nthari had been brilliant engineers before the Concorde crippled their development. The Brigani had been fierce warriors before chemical agents in their water supply made them docile and compliant. Dozens of civilizations had been hollowed out and rebuilt as grateful servants, never knowing what had been taken from the man at the center of this web of lies. Sat the Primarchs, the immortal ruling caste who had controlled the galaxy for longer than recorded history. They did not age, did not die, did not change. Their consciousness existed in vast computational networks that required constant expansion, and the archives revealed exactly where that expansion came from. Harvesting protocol was clinical in its horror. When a subject species reached sufficient population density, when their worlds grew fat with billions of thinking minds, the Primarchs would engineer a crisis: war, plague, environmental collapse, anything that would allow them to step in as saviors, while quietly processing millions of neural systems into raw computational substrate. The dead would become fuel for immortality, and the survivors would remember only that the Concorde had saved them. Humanity was scheduled for harvesting within the next 50 years. Their population had grown perfectly according to projections. Their gratitude had been carefully cultivated. They were ripe. Alara fell to her knees as the final data packets burned through her mind. Korath's voice echoed in her consciousness, weak and fading, telling her that she had to warn her people that humanity was the galaxy's last hope because they were still young enough to fight, still angry enough to resist, still human enough to refuse. She did not hesitate. Her fingers flew across her console as she opened a priority channel to Earth Command. 17 seconds later, Every major government on Earth received the complete contents of Korath's transmission. 17 seconds after that, she watched in horror as proximity alarms began screaming across her display. Concord had been monitoring all communications in human space. Of course they had. They monitored everything, controlled everything, saw everything. And now they were responding with the speed of a predator. That had spotted movement in the grass. Alara counted 47 warships, dropping out of FTL around Earth, their weapons already charging. The Concord called it a peacekeeping armada, but she recognized the formation. It was the same configuration used during the Nthari pacification, the Brigani correction, the dozen other euphemisms for planetary devastation. That filled the archives now burning in her mind. She tried to send another warning, but her communications ray had already been locked down by remote Concord override. She could only watch as the first plasma bombardment lit up the blue marble that had been her home. 17 cities turned to glass in the first wave. Their populations vaporized before they could even understand what was happening. The official broadcast from Concord High Command spoke of a viral memetic threat, a dangerous ideology that had infected human leadership and required immediate quarantine measures. They expressed deep regret for the necessary casualties and promised that humanity would be restored to proper function once the infection had been purged. Alara stood alone on the observation deck of a ship she no longer controlled, surrounded by crew members who stared at their screens in numb disbelief. She watched her world burn and felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. It was not despair. It was not fear. It was something far more dangerous. It was clarity. Concord had spent 3 centuries teaching humanity to be grateful. They had shaped an entire civilization around the idea that aliens had given them everything worth having. They had created a species of willing servants who would never question their benevolent masters. But they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that gratitude would survive the truth. They had never considered what would happen if their carefully cultivated livestock discovered. They had once been Wolvus. Alara looked at the burning world on her screen and made a promise to the dead archivist, whose gift had cost him everything. She would survive. She would escape, and she would teach the galaxy what happened when humanity stopped saying thank you. The stars outside her window had not changed, but everything else had. The universe she had believed in was a lie, and the only truth that remained was written in fire across the face of the earth. She had been a loyal servant of the Concord. For 15 years that woman was dead. Now something else was being born in her place. Earth burned for 3 days before the Concord declared victory. 17 major cities had been reduced to craters of molten glass, and 2 billion human beings had died in what the official reports called necessary quarantine measures. The peacekeeping armada hung in orbit like patient vultures, waiting for the survivors to accept their new reality. But something strange was happening in the ashes, something the Concord had never anticipated, something that would change the course of galactic history forever. Admiral Chen Weilin had been court-martialed 6 years ago for questioning Concord sovereignty over human military operations. He had spent those years in disgrace, stripped of his rank and forced to work as a cargo hauler on the outer colonies. But he had never stopped watching, never stopped preparing, never stopped believing that something was deeply wrong with humanity's so-called benefactorship. Alara's transmission reached Earth. Chen was already moving. He had spent years building a network of contacts who shared his suspicions. Hackers who had probed Concord systems for sport and found locked doors that should not exist. Engineers who had reverse-engineered alien technology in hidden laboratories and discovered it was deliberately inferior to what was possible. Veterans of forgotten conflicts who remembered how the Concord always seemed to benefit from human suffering. They called themselves the Unbound, and they had been waiting for this moment. Within hours of the bombardment, Chen broadcast a message on frequencies the Concord thought they had locked down. His voice crackled across 1,000 hidden receivers, reaching ears that the peacekeeping armada could not silence. They wanted us grateful, he said, his words cutting through static and despair. They wanted us dependent. They wanted us livestock. Show them what they raised instead. The response came from unexpected places. A mining colony on Europa had been secretly stockpiling weapons for decades. A research station on Titan had developed shield technology that exceeded anything the Concord had gifted to humanity. A network of smugglers operating in the asteroid belt possessed ships that had been modified in ways their original designers would not recognize. If Unbound Coalition rose from the ashes of Earth not as a government, but as a network. They had no central command that could be destroyed, no leaders that could be captured, no infrastructure that could be bombed. They were anger given form, spite given purpose. Humanity's darkest impulses turned toward a single shining goal. First real battle happened near the orbit of Mars. A Concord dreadnought called the Eternal Wisdom had broken formation to investigate unusual energy readings from a converted mining vessel. The dreadnought's captain was not concerned. Human ships were primitive things, barely capable of interstellar travel without Concord assistance. This would be a simple enforcement action. Gravity lance that tore through the Eternal Wisdom's hull should not have existed. The physics behind it required calculations that Concord analysts had determined were beyond human capability. The weapon drew power from a reactor that burned with energies the mining vessel's original design could never have contained. It was a weapon built from stolen schematics and human spite, assembled in secret by engineers who had been told their entire lives that they were not smart enough to build such things. The dreadnought died in silence, its crew never understanding what had killed them. The Concord fleet watched in disbelief as debris scattered across the void. For the first time in 10,000 years, a subject species had destroyed one of their warships. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the celebration that followed. That was one ship, he reminded his scattered forces. They have 10,000. We cannot win a war of attrition. We cannot match their numbers or their resources. We must fight a different kind of war. He was right, and everyone knew it. The Concord could replace a dreadnought in weeks. Humanity could barely keep their stolen ships running. Direct confrontation would end in extinction, but Chen had studied history. He had read about guerrilla warfare and asymmetric conflict and the power of ideas to bring down empires. He understood that the Concord's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. They ruled through trust. They maintained power through the carefully cultivated belief that they were benevolent protectors. Every species in the galaxy had been taught to love their chains. If that trust could be broken, everything would change. Commander Alara Vance escaped from Concord custody. During the chaos of the Mars engagement, she had been held aboard a prison transport scheduled for neural extraction and processing. But the crew had been distracted by news of the dreadnought's destruction, and Alara had not forgotten the combat training that had made her one of humanity's finest officers. She killed 7 guards with her bare hands before reaching an escape pod. The Concord had never considered that a grateful servant might turn violent. Their security protocols were designed for docile prisoners, not desperate. Wolveshen's network found her drifting in the void 3 days later. Her escape pod had no propulsion, no weapons, no hope. But she had something far more valuable. She still carried every byte of data that Korath the Archivist had given his life to transmit. They took our technology, she told Chen when they finally met aboard his flagship, a jury-rigged destroyer called the Defiance. They stole our future and sold it back to us as a gift. But they did not just do this to humanity. They did this to everyone. Chen understood immediately. The Concord was not one enemy but many. Every species that served them was another civilization that had been deceived, another population that might turn against their masters if they learned the truth. Then we give them the truth, Chen said. We show the galaxy what the Concord really is. We break the chains that hold 1,000 worlds in willing slavery. Alara nodded, and in that moment, the nature of the war changed. They would not defeat the Concord through military strength alone. They would defeat them by destroying the lies that held the galaxy together. Yuki Tanaka was a xenolinguist who had spent her career studying alien communication patterns. She had also spent her nights as one of the most wanted hackers in Concord space, penetrating systems that were supposed to be impenetrable. Chen recruited her personally, and she brought with her a team of specialists who understood that information could be more dangerous than any weapon. They began to plan the greatest information warfare campaign in galactic history. They would not just fight the Concord, they would expose them, but first, they needed to survive. The Concord fleet was regrouping, and their next attack would not be as careless as the first. The window for action was closing, and the stakes could not be higher across the solar system. Hidden factories worked round the clock. Ships were built in secret asteroid bases. Weapons were forged in the hearts of captured stations. Humanity was not preparing for a battle. Humanity was preparing for a reckoning. The Concord had spent 3 centuries believing they understood their livestock. They had studied human psychology, mapped human behavior, predicted human responses with mathematical precision, but they had only studied the humans who lived in gratitude. They had never encountered humans who lived in rage. They had no models for what happened when a species discovered they had been betrayed. By everything they believed in, that ignorance would cost them everything in the void between Mars and Jupiter. Admiral Chen looked at the scattered fleet that represented humanity's last hope. It was small, underpowered, held together by determination and recycled parts. By any reasonable measure, they had no chance of victory, but Chen had stopped believing in reasonable measures. The day his world burned, they made us, he said quietly. Watching the stars that had once seemed so welcoming, they shaped us into exactly what they wanted. They never considered that we might reshape ourselves into something they could not control. The next phase of the war was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. Drive Yuki Tanaka had spent 20 years studying how aliens communicated. She understood the subtle differences in syntax that could change meaning across species. She knew which frequencies carried official broadcasts and which ones were used for private whispers. She had mapped the information networks of the Concord with the patience of a spider building its web. No, she was going to burn that web to the ground. The plan was simple in concept, but impossibly complex in execution. Humanity would not just broadcast Koroth's archives. They would translate them into every major language in the galaxy. They would deliver them through channels that governments could not block. They would show every species in the Concord exactly what had been done to them. The truth is not enough, Yuki explained to the gathered resistance leaders. Information without context is just noise. We need to personalize this. We need to show each species their own chains. Her team had spent months analyzing the archives, cross-referencing historical records with Concord internal documents. They had found specific evidence of betrayal for dozens of civilizations. Each species would receive not just generic revelations, but detailed proof of exactly how they had been manipulative. Nthari would learn that their homeworld's ecological collapse had been engineered by Concord agents who introduced parasites into their food chain. The disaster that had forced them to accept Concord terraforming assistance had been deliberately created. Their gratitude for salvation was gratitude for being rescued from a fire their saviors had started. The Brigani would discover that their celebrated peaceful nature was not cultural evolution but chemical suppression. For 3 generations, agents in their water treatment systems had been adding compounds that dampened aggression and enhanced compliance. The proud warriors of their ancient legends had not chosen peace. They had been drugged into submission. The Valkyrie would face the most disturbing truth of all. Their priestly caste, the spiritual leaders who guided their civilization with divine visions, were biological puppets. Their minds contained implants that allowed the Primarchs to upload whatever prophecies served Concord interests. The gods the Valkyrie worshipped were not real. They were scripts written by their master. Admiral Chen contributed military resources to the operation. The Unbound Coalition had captured several Concord relay stations, giving them access to communication networks that should have been impossible to reach. Alara provided tactical coordination, ensuring that the broadcasts would happen simultaneously across the galaxy. If we stagger the releases, they will adapt, Alara warned. They will spin the first revelations as human lies and prepare counter-narratives for the rest. We need to hit them everywhere at once, overwhelm their ability to respond. The date was set. The translations were completed. The delivery systems were tested. And then humanity did something that no subject species had ever done before. They told the truth. The broadcasts began at exactly the same moment across 17,000 star systems. Concord censorship algorithms could not process the flood fast enough. By the time officials realized what was happening, billions of beings had already received the information. The reaction was not uniform. Some species refused to believe. Their faith in the Concord was too deep to shake with mere evidence. They dismissed the broadcasts as sophisticated human propaganda, exactly as their masters had predicted. The Concord moved quickly to reinforce this narrative, flooding the networks with reassuring messages and expert analysis that explained away every accusation, but others listened. Then the scientific community began independent investigations into the ecological collapse that had shaped their history. They found evidence that had been hidden for centuries, environmental data that did not match official records, genetic traces of organisms that could not have evolved naturally on their world. When they published their findings, riots erupted in 3 major cities. The Brigani response was more immediate and more violent. A faction of their population had always felt disconnected from their species' pacifist identity, troubled by aggressive impulses that their culture taught them to suppress. When they learned that those impulses were natural, that their ancestors had been warriors chemically transformed into servants, something ancient awakened in their blood. The first Brigani uprising killed 10,000 Concord administrators in a single night. The survivors fled to orbital stations, watching in horror as a species they had considered perfectly domesticated remembered how to fight, but nothing compared to the Valkyrie reaction. When the priests learned that their divine visions were uploaded lies, when they discovered that they had been puppets speaking words written by alien masters, the entire religious structure of their civilization collapsed in hours. Priests who had devoted their lives to serving the gods tore out their own implants with their bare hands, dying in agony rather than living as tools. To Valkyrie holy wars that followed would burn for decades. Event and species declared independence within a single standard week. They expelled Concord administrators, seized control of their own infrastructure, and began the painful process of discovering who they really were. 43 more species erupted into civil war, torn between those who accepted the truth and those who could not bear to believe it. The Primarchs watched their empire crumble and felt something they had not experienced in millennia. For they had built their power on secrets, on the carefully managed ignorance of lesser species. They had never prepared for what would happen if those secrets were exposed. Their contingency plans assumed localized rebellions that could be crushed individually. They had no protocols for a galaxy that was simultaneously waking up emergency councils. Convened in the heart of Concord space, for the first time in recorded history, the Primarchs disagreed about what to do. Some advocated immediate military action, crushing every rebellion before it could spread further. Others warned that such aggression would only confirm the accusations. The debate stretched for precious hours while the galaxy burned. Meanwhile, human ships pushed deeper into Concord territory. They did not come as conquerors seeking to claim new worlds. They came as witnesses, carrying recording equipment and broadcast arrays. Everywhere they went, they documented the chaos and shared it with anyone who would listen. Admiral Chen had understood something crucial about the nature of power. The Concord had ruled through perception as much as force. Their subject species had believed themselves to be protected, cared for, grateful. By showing the galaxy that others were fighting, that resistance was possible, that the Concord was not invincible. Humanity was doing more damage than any fleet could inflict. We are not an army. Chen told his captains, we are a mirror. We show the galaxy what it can become when it stops being afraid. The Concord eventually mobilized its military forces, but they faced a nightmare scenario. They could not be everywhere at once. Every ship sent to crush a rebellion was a ship that could not protect Concord installations elsewhere. Their carefully balanced fleet deployments had been designed for maintaining order, not fighting wars on 1,000 fronts. Alara led a squadron deep into territory that had once been considered absolutely secure. She broadcast continuously, showing images of Concord forces firing on civilian populations, documenting the atrocities that followed every failed rebellion. When Concord propaganda claimed the uprisings were peaceful transitions, human cameras showed the bodies in the streets. The truth was a weapon that could not be blocked or destroyed. Once released, it spread like a virus through populations that had been conditioned to trust. And everywhere it touched, chains began to break. But the Primarchs were not defeated. They were ancient, patient, and utterly ruthless. They had survived challenges before, had crushed rebellions that seemed unstoppable. had waited out crises that lesser beings thought would last forever. In the depths of their computational networks, they began to plan. If truth was the enemy, then truth would be silenced. If communication enabled rebellion, then communication would be controlled. If their subject species would not obey willingly, they would be given no choice. If galaxy had been locked in grateful servitude for 10,000 years, it was time to remind everyone why the next phase of the Primarch's response would be more terrible than anything humanity had yet witnessed. And when it came, there would be no escape. The stars themselves would become a prison and no one would be able to run. The seizure happened at exactly midnight, Concord Standard Time. Across the entire galaxy, every ship equipped with Concord designed faster-than-light drives suddenly stopped moving. Engines that had functioned perfectly for centuries went dead. Vessels that had been traveling between stars found themselves frozen in the void, unable to continue their journeys, unable to return home, unable to do anything but drift. Primarchs had activated their final contingency, and the galaxy learned the true price of accepting gifts from Master Shiden. In the quantum architecture of every FTL drive was a kill switch that had been installed at the moment of manufacture. The Concord had never mentioned this feature to their subject species. They had never needed to. For 10,000 years, no one had given them a reason to use it. No, they pressed the button, and the galaxy screamed. Admiral Chen was aboard the Defiance when the engines died. One moment they were traveling toward a rendezvous point in liberated space. The next moment they were motionless, their drive systems completely unresponsive. Emergency lights flickered as power systems struggled to compensate for the sudden loss report. Chen demanded, his voice steady despite the cold fear spreading through his chest. All propulsion offline. His chief engineer responded, her fingers flying across diagnostic panels. FTL drive is completely locked. Sublight engines are functioning but barely. We have minimal maneuvering capability and nothing else across the ship. Crew members stared at each other in growing horror. They were not close to any habitable world. They were not near any supply station. They were in the empty void between stars, and they suddenly had no way to leave. If Primarch's broadcast began exactly 1 minute after the seizure, their collective voice echoed through every communication system in the galaxy, reaching every frozen ship, every stranded fleet, every terrified population. You wish to expose us, the Primarchs declared, their words carrying the weight of ancient authority. Now witness the truth entire. Without us, you are nothing. Without our order, you are lost children in an infinite darkness. You cannot travel without our permission. You cannot survive without our protection. You cannot exist without our grace. The message continued with clinical precision. The Primarchs explained exactly what would happen to species that did not immediately surrender. Supply lines would be cut. Colonies would starve. Populations would wither in the cold between stars. The galaxy's interconnected civilization would collapse into isolated pockets of desperation, each one easily crushed when the Primarchs decided to restore their control. Surrender the humans. Who poisoned your minds with lies? The Primarchs commanded. Accept reconditioning to remove the memetic contamination they spread. Return to the order that has sustained you for millennia, or die in the dark, alone and forgotten. A cautionary tale for future generations who might consider rebellion. The ultimatum was absolute. Species had 30 standard days to comply. After that, the Primarchs would begin systematic elimination of all resistant population. Cellera listened to the broadcast from the bridge of her crippled vessel. Her squadron had been caught in deep space, far from any friendly port. They had enough supplies for perhaps 2 months. After that, they would begin to die. How is this possible? She whispered, staring at the dead controls that should have carried them to safety. Her science officer had been studying the engine lockout since it began. His face was pale as he delivered his findings. It was always there, he said, his voice hollow with betrayal, built into the fundamental architecture of every drive system. We never noticed because it was never activated. The Concord gave us technology that was designed from the beginning to be their leash. The irony was devastating. Humanity had fought to free the galaxy from Concord control, and now they discovered that every species' ability to travel between stars had always been conditional. The Concord had not just suppressed humanity's original FTL technology, They had replaced it with a system that could be remotely disabled at any moment across the galaxy. Hope began to die. The rebellions that had seemed so promising collapsed as their supply lines vanished. Populations that had celebrated their independence found themselves cut off from food, medicine, and essential resources. Leaders who had proclaimed freedom now had to explain to their people that freedom meant starvation. Some species surrendered immediately. They had no choice. Their worlds depended on interstellar trade for survival. Without FTL travel, they would die within weeks. The Primarchs accepted their submissions with cold satisfaction, dispatching reconditioning teams to purge the memetic contamination. From their populations, others chose defiance, preferring death to renewed slavery. Then Thari declared that they would rather fade into extinction than kneel again. The Brigani warriors, who had remembered their true nature, swore oaths to fight until the last breath. The Valkyrie survivors of the Holy Wars prayed to gods they now knew were false, finding strange comfort in faiths they had created themselves. But defiance without action was just a slower form of surrender. Across the galaxy, resistance leaders searched desperately for any solution, any hope, any way to break the chains that had suddenly tightened around their throats. Admiral Chen gathered his senior officers in the Defiance's conference room. Their faces showed exhaustion and despair. They had fought so hard and come so far, only to discover that they had never truly escaped their cage. There has to be something we missed, Chen insisted, his fists clenched on the table. The Concord cannot have thought of everything. No system is perfect. There must be a weakness we can exploit. Alara sat in the corner, saying nothing. Her eyes were distant, focused on memories that seemed to flicker at the edge of her consciousness. The data from Korath's archives still lived in her neural implant, vast repositories of information that she had only begun to process. A thing was nagging at her. A footnote she had glimpsed during her initial review, a discarded project mentioned in passing, a technology that the Primarchs had deemed too unstable for lesser species. The original human FTL drive, she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the despair that filled the room. Evrian turned to look at her. Chen's eyes narrowed with sudden hope. What about it? He asked. The Concord stole it 300 years ago, Alara explained, her mind racing as she assembled fragments of memory. They replaced it with their own inferior system, but the archives mentioned why they suppressed it. They said our technology was too unstable, too dangerous, too primitive. How does that help us? Her science officer asked. They destroyed all records of the original research. Alara shook her head. A smile was forming on her face, the first genuine smile she had felt since watching Earth burn. They destroyed the records on Earth, she said, but they did not know about the paranoid engineers who never trusted alien gifts. They did not know about the secret laboratory beneath the Antarctic ice. They did not know that a prototype still exists. The room erupted. Voices overlapped as officers demanded details, asked questions, voiced doubts and hopes in equal measure. But Chen's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Can we reach it? He asked. Alara's smile faded. Antarctica was on Earth, and Earth was under Concord occupation. Reaching the prototype would mean returning to the home world that had been turned into a prison, sneaking past the armada that had murdered billions, and somehow extracting technology that had been hidden for 3 centuries. It will be almost impossible, she admitted. Chen stood, his spine straightening as determination replaced despair. Then we will do the almost impossible, he said, because the alternative is surrender, and I would rather die trying than live as livestock. The plan began to take shape. They would use their minimal sublight engines to reach a hidden supply cache. They would gather resources and allies. They would find a way back to Earth, and they would retrieve the one piece of technology that the Concord could not control. Somewhere in the frozen darkness beneath Antarctic ice, humanity's true inheritance waited. All they had to do was claim Ith Galaxy was locked in a prison of its own gratitude, frozen by technology that had been designed as a leash from the very beginning. But humans had never been good at staying in cages, and the Primarchs were about to learn why. The Prometheus II was built in 17 months of desperate labor, hidden in the hollow core of an asteroid, assembled from salvaged parts and stolen materials. It represented everything humanity had left to give. The volunteers who crewed it knew they would probably die, And they came anyway. Commander Alara Vance stood on the bridge of a ship that should not exist, looking at a crew who had chosen hope over survival. Behind them, the frozen galaxy waited for salvation or extinction. Ahead of them, Primarch space bristled with warships that would destroy them the moment they were detected. The Prometheus had something no other ship in the galaxy possessed. It carried humanity's original faster-than-light drive, retrieved from beneath Antarctic ice by a suicide mission that had cost the lives of 300 soldiers. The ancient prototype had been rebuilt and improved by engineers who understood physics that the Concorde had tried to erase from existence. The human FTL drive did not fold space. Like Concorde technology, it did not create wormholes or manipulate gravity wells. It simply ignored the rules that said faster-than-light travel was impossible. It was a brute force solution, crude and powerful. Exactly the kind of thing the elegant Primarchs had dismissed as primitive. But primitive meant simple, and simple meant no kill switch, no hidden architecture designed to betray its users, no chains built into its fundamental structure. When Alara gave the order to activate the drive, the Prometheus vanished from normal space. Concorde sensors, designed to track their own technology, registered nothing. The ship that carried humanity's answer to the seizure had become invisible. They appeared in the heart of Primarch space without warning, materializing so close to the collective's central processing station that defensive systems could not react in time. For a single perfect moment, humanity's flagship hung in the void beside the ancient structures that had controlled the galaxy. For 10,000 years, Alara wasted no time. Her crew had trained for this moment. Every second counted. The broadcast began immediately, transmitting on every frequency the Concorde used, punching through jamming systems that had never been designed to block signals. From within their own territory, "This is Commander Alara Vance of the human vessel Prometheus 2, she announced, her voice carrying across the frozen galaxy. "The Primarchs told you that you cannot travel without their permission. They lied." The schematics followed her words. Detailed blueprints for the human FTL drive translated into every major language in the galaxy. The technical specifications were complete. The construction guides were clear. The mathematics were explained in terms that engineers of any species could understand. "We are not giving you a weapon," Alara continued as the data stream poured into the void. "We are giving you a key. Build this drive and you will never be locked in place again. Build this drive and the Primarchs can never threaten your survival again. Build this drive and you will be free." The Primarch's fleet began to converge on her position. Hundreds of warships changed course, abandoning their patrol routes to destroy this impossible intruder. The Prometheus had minutes at most before overwhelming firepower reduced it to atom spit. The broadcast was already spreading. Across the frozen galaxy, engineers who had despaired of ever moving again received the schematics. Scientists who had believed faster-than-light travel was only possible through Concorde technology studied the equations and realized they had been deceived. The knowledge that humanity had recovered began its unstoppable spread through populations that had thought themselves doomed. Admiral Chen's voice joined the transmission from his own frozen ship, adding urgency to Alara's message. "We are not here to rule you," he declared. "We are not offering ourselves as new masters to replace the old. We are telling you what we learned when our world burned. You were never as weak as they made you believe. You were never as dependent as they wanted you to think. The only chains that truly bound you were the ones you accepted." The first Primarch warship opened fire. The Prometheus shuddered as defensive shields absorbed impacts they were never designed to withstand. Damage reports flooded the bridge. Crew members died at their stations, continuing their work until the final moment. Alara watched her console light up with responses from across the galaxy. The Valkyrie survivors were the first to confirm receipt, their broken priesthood finding new purpose in spreading the message of freedom. Then Thari followed, their scientists already adapting the schematics to their own manufacturing capabilities. The Brigani warriors swore they would build 100 ships and tear down everything the Concorde had created. Species that had surrendered in despair now saw hope. Populations that had accepted reconditioning rather than starve received proof that resistance was possible. The Primarch's ultimatum had forced everyone to choose between freedom and death, And now humanity was offering a third option. They will destroy us. Alara's tactical officer reported, his voice steady despite the destruction consuming the ship around them. Impact in 90 seconds, Alara nodded. She had always known this was a one-way mission. The Prometheus II was not built to survive. It was built to transmit. It was built to prove that humanity would rather die free than live as slaves. Keep broadcasting. She ordered. Every second we survive is another million beings who receive the schematics. The ship bucked as another volley struck. Atmosphere began venting from breaches in the hull. Power systems failed one by one. But the transmission continued, and the responses kept coming. 60 seconds. Brigani confirmed they had begun construction on their first prototype. Nthari engineers reported that human technology was more compatible with their own original designs than anyone had expected. The Valkyrie had already distributed the schematics to hidden resistance cells. Across their territory, 40 seconds, a fragment of debris struck the bridge viewport, and Alara watched cracks spiderweb across the glass. Through the damage, she could see the Primarch processing station that had controlled the galaxy for millennia. Its lights flickered with uncertainty as its ancient minds struggled to comprehend what was happening. 20 seconds, Alara thought about Earth, about the cities that had burned, about the billions who had died never knowing that their species would defy the masters of the galaxy. She thought about Korath the Archivist, who had given his life to send her the truth. She thought about Admiral Chen, whose stubborn refusal to kneel had sparked a fire that would never be extinguished. In seconds, Smilith Prometheus II died in a bloom of fire that was visible from the Primarch homeworld. The Concord's networks filled with celebrations of this human defeat, this final destruction of the species that had caused so much chaos. But the celebrations were premature across the frozen galaxy. Engineers who had received the schematics were already building in hidden laboratories and secret workshops, on stations that the Concord thought were powerless and worlds they had written off as defeated. The keys to freedom were being forged. First independent FTL jump happened 3 weeks after the Prometheus I's destruction. Ainthari science vessel vanished from Concord sensors and reappeared halfway across the galaxy, its crew broadcasting proof that the human technology worked. The second jump happened the next day. The third and fourth happened simultaneously. Within a month, dozens of species had built their own drives and broken free of the Seizure. Primarchs tried to adapt. They sent fleets to destroy the factories building the new drives. They broadcast propaganda claiming the technology was flawed and dangerous. They threatened and bribed and manipulated as they always had, but the truth could not be unlearned. The keys could not be unforged. The galaxy that had been locked in servitude was remembering how to move. 50 years later, the monument to the Prometheus II stood at the center of the Free Concord's capital. It had been built not by humans, but by the species humanity had helped to liberate. The statue showed Commander Alara Vance standing at her console, hand raised in defiance, surrounded by the crew who had died to deliver freedom. The inscription, translated into 3,000 languages, read, "They called us primitive. They called us dangerous. They called us livestock." They were right about two of those things. Humanity had not become rulers of the galaxy. They had become something far more terrifying to tyrants everywhere. They had become proof that chains could be broken. Primarchs still existed, diminished and isolated, their ancient empire reduced to a handful of systems that clung to the old ways. They watched the galaxy they had once controlled thrive without them, and they remembered the lesson humanity had taught them: never cage something that would rather burn than kneel across 1,000 worlds. Monuments stood in honor of the species that had refused to be grateful. Human names were spoken with reverence by beings who had never seen Earth. The story of the Prometheus II was taught to children of every species, a tale of sacrifice and hope and the power of a single truth spoken loudly enough to shatter lies that had endured for millennia. And somewhere in the quantum noise between stars, a message still echoed. The final words Commander Alara Vance had broadcast before the fire consumed her ship, words that had become the motto of the Free Concord, inscribed on the hulls of ships and the walls of governments and the hearts of beings who would never again accept chains.